Good evening. This is Kicking the Ballistics with Jimmy James. Our current subject coming this fall is actually what everyone is talking about in America. It is the election that supersedes any other election that Americans dominance around the world. What we have here is Biden running up for re-election, which is a predicament with the previous administration with the GOP contender back 4 years ago. And we knew what happened then. So usually when we're talking about our administration in the U.S. and how it succeeds itself before and after is how the predicaments are going forward. So when you have the first 4 years of any administration, be it Republican or Democrat, you would think that to roll up to the next chapter, and that would be a second administration. Well, we knew that 8 years ago when Trump won first to only lose the second time around. Hence, Biden. So now we accumulate those two administration, 4 years of the GOP and 4 years of the current Democratic. What we would come up to, in some cases, we call it bupkis, right? We have infighting, and we know how domestic policies are overlaid with overseas policies, and how with the debt ceiling rounding off to the nearest decimal point, we give or take $100 billion. In that kind of connotation, how do they keep the lights on in America? Well, this is what Americans are asking, and how other people know self-defeating is also evident when you're bankrupt. Now, with the debt ceiling climbing so high, who does that appease to pay that high interest rate? So I'm not going to get here into politics, but I'm going to give my 2 cents to say what is pertinent in the information of common knowledge. I'm a Canadian, born and raised, and I'm proud to be Canadian, god damn it, and that's my right to know what that actually means. Now, what we have in the most recent, what people in America are talking about, these are some of the things we're talking about. Guns, abortion, our commerce, our healthcare, our housing. And these are just some of the subjects on everyone's dinner table. So when we accumulate that, why is it so expensive to turn the lights on in America? Because it's obligations to NATO. For example, like when we talk about NATO and its obligations to other countries, including Canada, and how they're overseas, what it really means. For example, let me go broaden my scope. Let's talk about what's happening right now between those areas between China and the western front of Europe, which is the backlog of the trading Silk Road. For example, when they talk about, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, well, they have some idea what it actually means, but when we talk about India in itself, it's Hindu people who believe in a different connotation of their own religion, right? But it's admired too when we are talking about prehistoric times. When we're talking about what does that mean, not all the way to the dinosaur age, but just about 100 years ago, which is not too far distant. Not even that. Even in the 50s, when we know the Beatles went there to talk about how they were enlightened. But that was different times about how we're talking about the Ganges River. It's only political science that you would have to know the real answer. But we're also talking about their neighbors between the contested regions of Kashmir, between India and Pakistan, right? And what lies between them. Well, I don't have to ask you what's on your dinner table, but these are the same questions we're asking, right? For example, well, Pakistan is actually cohabitating with its relations with America, so they can have the ears dropped to know what's going on, right? But does that secure their money, that their endowment? I don't know. Last time figures I checked is $800 million. That's a big chunk of change for Pakistan to have that kind of currency running there. So, since Afghanistan, we know how contentious that region is as an opium trading partner. Nothing else grows there except opium and other ideas how to preclude the harsh lifestyle, harsh living they have over there. When we're talking about history, we don't have to talk about when the area that's garnered between Afghanistan and Russia is a barren land, right? So when Russia went there to arm their forces, they knew there was something particular about that, but there's nothing egregious to know how some people may live. So when they had the altercations at that time, the U.S. objectified and entered their 2 cents to thwart the persuasion of the comrades that fought. But what did it really mean? Pashtuanis, who were there to fighting, later realized they're the same people that America are fighting now in a way that they thought for anyone in that country to help that country in its time of need, right? But after 10, 20 years to help that country, we knew that, education is the foremost. What America lacks is to deny those people is also a tool used to dissuade how people's lives are led. For example, Afghanistan is not going to be old time too soon to adopt American ideas, but when you talk about how Canadians and other NATO obligatory reasoning to help this country is to build. But after 10, 20 years, we found out it was more objectional. Because one time or another, you're self governing is to self govern your own country. So when Americans or Canadians decide to say, we overstayed our welcome, please take care of your country, and they left their armaments and they hit the road because there's no sense in knowing what happened in Vietnam couldn't happen in Afghanistan, and that's the predicament we had. So this isn't so hard to tell, but we found out. So during that exodus, we also found out, what other reasoning that came when we talk about educating women, which is not so far to go to say, but it also invokes other people's ideas, how people live their lives conformably different than Americans or Canadians, right? To garner that idea is also to take care of your home, but to empower those people in doctrine, which also was conforming to people how they want certain things to change. What ain't broke, don't fix. So the opium trade grew, but we knew what that meant too. The opium trade is dead, my friends. Fentanyl has come over and taken over by pharmaceuticals making it chemicals, sort of like other narcotics that are traded and objectionably used as a stepping stone to use in other ways, which I won't get into, but that was the reasoning why, and they're still asking these questions. But when you're talking about now Pakistan and their nuclear armament and Imran Khan, now I can't speak to say per se, but a person like that who has access to a nuclear armament is very conforming to partners in those countries. They want to make sure someone has the right steady hand to know to make sure that this falls in the wrong hands. And you don't have to tell me how they procured it or how they got it. That's not for me to know. It's for you to find out. But regardless, that is a one contested region of how people talk about America's backyard and how much money it takes to keep the lights on. So you're asking about these NATO obliged countries, how much America supplies that money. So when you're talking about that, and the objection is to spend it on your availability on your defense or your offense, is also questioning. So during this time, we don't have to look too far back to what happened in Iraq, right? The first time going was George Sr. and George W., right? And it destroyed the country in essence. When we talk about it, this isn't a board game, this isn't Risk, but these are the people, the president Cheney, and you can see it unfolds. Now, democracy is what's upholded in America, is the doctrine how we live our life. We don't live in China to know they're a communist country and they control their media and mass media to a perfect T. To say, look what's happened in America, to collect that, to teach them how to doctrine their ways. But they don't believe in a higher power necessarily. They don't believe in any religion, and they don't allow it because that's conforming to the ways how China people lives. They only believe in that dollar bill, right? And now they have that money is a capitulation after Vietnam. After 78, we know Johnson and then Nixon resigned. It was kind of marred in their ideas how they couldn't successfully, put South Vietnam to doctrine of that philosophy uh, of American ideology. But those people who lived northern part in the disparaging, we don't have to know what happened after that. So, and previous to that, in the 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it seems like we go through this circle over and over again to actually know what it actually means in today's times. Right? So we know that this kind of idea was an idea that we set forward with China to normalize relations as an insult to their defeat of America's ideas to have these corporations now say, hey, we can get people working back. Why don't you fix our products so we can buy it for the dime? Right? And at this time, it sounded okay, but to what reasoning? For example, all those resources that would need to make those cars or those trinkets or those chocolate bars or anything that you might need, even your baseball jerseys, right? So this time in the 80s, they pushed that, which was also kind of ideal. But when we decided to send all our resources, man, didn't they take the handful for them? So going forward now, we're asking about NATO obligations into other countries in Europe, particularly, right? So I'm not going to compare, in the 75 years post World War II. Only historians can know that. You can't, condense it to one time period. It's over years and years. Only at my age, you can be rest assured that there are historians that will teach you going forward. So now we know when Trump or the previous administration, like Biden, the obligation is so enormous, the Pentagon knows. So again, to keep the the lights on, how do we know, since forward, that we know they can be used in a way? Well, there are things beyond our greater our forces to know that there are not things that we cannot control. But we can control our borders' sake to know sometimes that some things don't work. You give that group to say if it doesn't work, these are the ramifications, right? So no, anytime soon, when we're talking about contested regions and going back, we have to ask yourself what happened in Iraq. That is way farther away from my mind to know in Canada, where we live. We understand that too, as American friends of ours in the south of the border, as it's one of us best, most important trading partner. So we shouldn't be apprehensive, but we should also take it at heed. So during the first invasion and the second invasion, it was conforming, but yet there were preclusion to say what are the needs for those countries. For example, in the northern region that goes all the way to Constantinople, which is now called Istanbul, to all the way south, to all the way to Yemen, to the Iran, to all those countries, it's a boiling pot of mess, right? Constructed by either grievances or what they said, the hospitality of our country we want to help. So when we're asking about Armenia, Kurdistan, right? These are things like people say these are own homegrown terrorist organizations that other countries might say facilitate. So Americans would say because of those religions, ideas of say Armenian or Kurdistan or whatever the religion they might so adapt to is not so different from a Muslim, a Hebrew, or a cleric for listens to Christianity or the ultra orthodox. They're always conforming to know what's best, but the more that they push, the more that they have the angst against them. So that's what the issue at beforehand. So during that time, that oil field rich, he had disparaging ideas. And when you're talking about what happened. Now, to make infighting, to make it engrossed, is also to say take grievances, because in the Western Front we celebrate all ideas of all faiths, which is a good issue at the time when we talk about in your own house and how you use in your clerics or your jami or in your synagogues, right? These are the questions that are people asking. So when we knew like Kurdistan and those were oil rich, we would talk to other people. How would you do commerce? And they would know not from the Dead Sea or the Red Sea, how we know how that water is the infrastructure of our mountains in Aratat to know what they're talking about in Turkey. So when they knew the cost of fuel cost, they made a bargain that the Americans would honor that system as long as everyone would get along. The Muslims, the Hebrews, and the Christians to supply that avenue. But after infighting, and the seclusion, we decided to come. What does America really want? And we don't have to ask or Wolf Blitzer when they were in their hotel and they were realizing prior to those that forecasts those B-52s were on their way to bomb when Powell was saying that we wanted Tony Blair, to capitulate. But at this time, Christians said no. Every other country said no, and then that backing, I went to bed knowing that they wouldn't have done that to wake up to find out they did that. That was that destruction and mayhem which caused that inbreeding of that fighting that they're talking about still today. Right? So when Netanyahu calls in for the Americans to help them out in their time of need, it is also dastardly to know what that actually means, right? So it's like going playing that old record and you get to that skip and it's always at that exact time of frame of mind that it's very, very hostile intent. So now look at all those regions. So during that time, let's fast forward 10, 20 years, that you have 25 million people running from war of those avenues that you bombarded. And they ran all to the bordered areas to get protection from hostilities. Why wouldn't they? But they would say, look at our country, look what has happened. And an American realized that someone has to pay for that tab to take care of those peoples. But instead of them giving the books, what did they have? They live in a rural side of the roadside to say now the confronting people of those of the upper echelons to the lower, between Gaza and everyone else. It's about more and more people displaced. So at this time, Erdogan or the king of Jordan, they would ask America, please have good intentions because these are people in our backyard necessarily don't know what's happening. And it causes inling. And again, you would have these children growing up to know that their future is at stake, to know what's happening. And it's rather sad to say, but that is how it is. And eventually, when the other areas of those areas that the NATO allies like Turkey with America say, we need your support, America, but also what this is your mess. You have to conform those ideas of what you really oblige themselves to put themselves, and those people would later on know what happened after and what caused terror. Right? So it only takes one loudmouth and one idiot with one grenade to say some shit like that, excuse my French, to cause what happened in Istanbul airport, of that people migrates running, and you have different factions for different reasons. Okay? Even in Toronto, we felt it. We felt it most recently, even in Moscow, Russia, which also is equivalent to what they're saying about the Biden administration to run up. Now let's put our wagon and steer and say, whoa, right? Now we're talking about this election and what it means. Hello, Bernie Sanders. Okay, now before Bernie Sanders would run up, Biden and Kamala were the running mates. And at this time, Bernie Sanders was chipping away at the resolution to say, let's worry about their domestic policy. Let's worry about our education. Let's worry about our jobs. Not necessarily what's happening in Israel. We have to worry about home and domestic policies. And in his policy is like to say have education for all, which is noble, like Canadians should, like they do in UK, which in part one time they knew their education was free. How privileged is that to know? That when we're talking about how rural areas and people who have to take massive amount of loan just to get that education to be a doctor or a lawyer. So we realize that there is no grievance to say that what maybe someone will say later on to say to accept the acceptability of that debt to run forward is never a shame to know like someone's rap sheet in some mogul's industry. But nevertheless, these are the issues they're saying. Well, now what does Bernie Sanders stand for? Socialism, which is different when you're talking about democracy and what goes forward. Hence, now, if say Bernie Sanders would run an election plan for who would be his running mate, who would the Pentagon support to know that if 4 years of the GOP and 4 years of the DMC, Democrats, what says Bernie Sanders can't do the job? And that's what we thought. We shouldn't have laid that 8 years of GOP and 8 more years of that 16 years, and then wait henceforward and see, if we're telling tales from the crypt, right, my friends? So we have to understand what's most important is the democracy that would then entailed to say when Trump says, about their ideals of NATO obligations to build armaments to protect who? Right? When we ask Canadians, and we know about our backyard, and then you would insult us to say something like that. I go, who's our enemies to know what Canadians stand for? First of all, we stand on our own ability to say, thank you very much. Right? But then when we decide the landscape from the West Coast of Maritimes, we talk about what we knew past tense when we ask about what happened to Titanic. If there was a ship about, maybe all of them could have been saved at once. But regardless, we're asking these questions going forward. Now, come tell tells that November is on our back door, and I can't say for certain, but there's other issues to know that the Pentagon knows it's a massive bill to say an enormous bill in order to maintain peace. This is Jimmy James signing out.